All right, so apparently there's fraud outside the United States. Let's hear about that.
Thank you very much, Frank. Great to see you, Herb, if you're watching. And welcome back to Oxford. It falls to me really just to introduce the panel on this extraordinary story of the German the dividend tax scandal, or the cum-ex scandal, as it's called. On my left here, the first Titanic interviewee that we have here, a titan of the subject, is Professor Christoph Spengel from the University of Mannheim. He's a professor of tax, and he's presented now twice to the European Parliament, once in 2018 and once in 2021, on exactly this subject, and is a recognized expert on it. To his left, an associate fellow here at the Said Business School, who's Richard Collier, who is also an extreme expert on this subject, having written one of the seminal books on this already. And he spent 2 years working on that book, and it really deals with, I guess, the policy implications actually coming from the cum-ex scandal. And the person who's charged with bringing these two to heel is our very own Philip Stafford from the FT, who's been at the Financial Times now for 20 years, studying markets and finance for the FT for 20 years. So, Philip, over to you.
Many thanks. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We're going to tell you a tale about a fascinating fraud involving lots of raids, banks, and it's still ongoing and it has a very strange name. So, Christoph, I want to turn to you. And first of all, just for anybody who really isn't sure what's going on, what exactly has happened here, and that gives it its name, the strange Latin name?
Yeah, strange Latin name. So to explain that very briefly, if you are a shareholder and you receive a dividend, there is a tax withheld on that dividend, right. And some shareholders are entitled to get a refund of this tax due to double taxation conventions or whatever. So that's the normal way. And now we talk about these Latin words, right? And short sales and all that stuff. And that means if you sell shares before the dividend record day, they are entitled to a dividend, and that's cum. With a dividend, and a short sale just implicates that you deliver the shares after the dividend record day to the short buyer, so ex-dividend. So the short buyer is not a legal owner, not the economic, but all of a sudden he received a second tax voucher and got a refund for this tax.
And so the people who are exempt from the taxation, who could get the refund, typically what kind of people would they be?
That could be, say, US-based pension funds, and according to double taxation conventions, they were entitled.
So they would be overseas people,
right?
It wouldn't necessarily affect German nationals.
No.
This would be for anyone who was wanting to trade these overseas.
Right.
So effectively, what was going on then? It's clearly around this dividend date. Just explain a little bit more about what happened at this dividend date, and where we went from here.
So we should be aware that the total tax damage is about 80 billion euro with related transactions. So there were, say, investment funds who tried to sell that shares short, and we talk about a 3-digit amount of billions of euro which were invested in individual transactions. That means you need to raise a lot of equity capital, which then has been leveraged multiple times by banks in order to finance that short sales. So what you need is first, someone who deals shares and someone who acts as a short seller. You need banks to finance these transactions. You need brokers, to really set up these transactions on a short-term period, and you need lawyers, writing opinions about the legality of these.
So just to clarify, what would happen is somebody would buy the shares around the dividend dates, maybe a day or two before,
Yep.
take ownership of them legally? Would they take legal ownership of them
Later on.
later on? And so they would, what would they be doing? Somebody would hold that on their behalf.
Yeah.
The dividend date passes, and then
You deliver the shares,
yeah,
but you are not the owner in a short sale.
mm-hmm.
So you buy them after the dividend record day, and you can only deliver them ex-dividend,
Yeah.
right, to someone buying that shares. And he gets a second tax voucher. And what should you do with shares at a value of 20 billion euro? You retransfer them back. The only purpose was to get a second tax voucher.
So
to get a refund.
effectively, you're generating a fraudulent tax voucher here that goes to the national authority.
Right.
And the total for that, you think, is roughly about 80 billion.
80 billion. Right.
Just to really clarify here, this isn't just a German issue, is it?
It's not just a German issue. So the German stock market was hit most, but we have strong evidence that Denmark has been hit, that Italy, Austria, so a lot of European countries, and we have also evidence from the German prosecutor, that almost all famous banks around the world were involved, are from all continents, and that we have organizations, buying these shares as short buyers, that they also come from multiple countries. So it's really a world scandal, and it's a problem of the European capital market. And we should also ask on how long has that been lasting.
Can we just get a few, to get a sense of just how broad it was in terms of the trading? I mean, there was a lot of trading that was done around the dividend date, wasn't there?
Yeah. So, we have now at the courts, at the criminal courts, we have individual transactions. And it's all about the tax damage. And say if you talk about the tax damage of 300 million euro, that's the dividend withholding tax, right? Which is about 25% of the dividend. So you talk roughly, in one case, about a dividend of 1 billion euro. And if you say, okay, what is the return on dividend? What is the value of shares? Say if you take a dividend ratio of 5%, that means the trading volume has been 20 billion euro in a single case. And that's more money than most of the richest individuals in the world earn.
It was there have been already some fines handed out. The FCA here in the UK has said that trading of about up to 35 times the average amount that was taking place on the Danish exchange, for example, maybe a bit less than on the Belgian exchange. Can you just explain to the audience here why some countries were hit and others less so?
So above all, it's a technical issue about the mechanism how dividend tax is collected and how the refund of the tax vouchers is organized. So there is a mismatch in that technical system, and the mismatch existed, as you have mentioned, in some countries, but not in all countries, because the technical system has been very vulnerable.
Richard, can we just pick up on that point, that this is a mismatch? Is this really effectively an arbitrage between how the settlement system works on the one side for markets and how the tax system works?
Well, that's certainly the way I look at it. The transaction itself is phenomenally complicated, and Christoph's done a very heroic effort of trying to summarize it, but it really is very, very complex. CumEx transactions would typically always involve short, stock borrowing, derivative trades, and so on. So there's a real complexity to that. And the way I look at the trade is that it's essentially trying to exploit the different treatments that you see in a tax system and a settlement system. They don't really quite work together.
Right.
And so for me, it has some much wider implications about things like complexity, how we manage complexity or how we create complexity. I guess one obvious point is we shouldn't be creating high complexity that we can't manage.
Does this mean that also that's, I mean, how can you actually really begin to simplify that complexity? Because effectively you're dealing with certainly in Europe, a sort of a cross-border system, when, as we all know, tax and even settlement of shares tends to be a very national thing.
Well, that's certainly true. A good starting point would be to recognise that there is inherent complexity in interlocking systems, a number of interlocking systems. So a good starting point would be to recognise that we shouldn't contribute more complexity to that. Now, I can't think of any kind of system that generates greater complexity than the tax system does in relation to the way it taxes financial products. So, and I don't think there is any realization of the kind of issues, or not sufficient recognition of the kind of issues that are created with that deep complexity that's created in domestic systems, particularly when they interlock with other tax systems and the way they interlock with banking and settlement systems.
Christoph, can we just look at the COMEX scandal at the moment, in terms of where we are in terms of authorities investigating it? Have there actually been people sent to prison yet? Just giving an idea of where we are in terms of punishments.
Yeah, the German public prosecutor investigates for a decade now, and there are more than 1,500 suspected, among them many CEOs from international banks. We have about 150 cases. As I explained, the case could be a three-digit million amount of money, and we have now 5 court decisions by criminal courts, and the punishment is rather hard. So there has been a fund manager of a German private bank, and he has been in prison for 5.5 years at the age of 77. And the court claims the money back, and the banks are still there.
Is it a fairly straightforward case to prove, or are there grey areas? How hard is it to explain to a judge and a jury what's going on?
Well, it's interesting to be invited as a tax professor on a fraud conference. And tax fraud is criminal. And it's about not to disclose these complex transactions, not to disclose who is involved, on which continents. And talking about the punishment, okay, to get imprisoned at the age of 58, that would be very painful. And maybe I start talking as a witness, and we have some witnesses who really disclose, the schemes, and not the emails. It was the chats, the SMS chats, okay, with the brokers, and so the prosecutor was really able to detect the whole scheme. And that's, I think, similar to other fraudulent schemes that someone tends to talk.
Richard, for those of us who've followed it, we've seen, we've followed the network of money. Maybe somebody would ask to do it based in an offshore location. They may ask their broker based in London to put on the trades. They do the trades in whether it be Frankfurt or Copenhagen or Brussels or wherever. It becomes quite a network, a cross-border network. We all know that tax authorities are famously quite protective of their own information. I mean, was this really kind of an arbitrage, and using that desire to keep control of information? Was that really at the heart of it, that they wanted to arbitrage tax authorities?
Well, you certainly raise a lot of issues in that question. Responding directly to the tax authority point, I think there are a number of lessons for tax authorities. There's clearly an issue about knowledge of the tax authority, knowledge on the part of the tax authorities of the markets and the way the markets work. as Christoph mentioned, there's been huge trades in volumes of securities around dividend dates, and that was not really picked up by, you wouldn't expect it to be picked up by tax authorities, it wasn't picked up by regulatory authorities. I think in Germany it's the case, and certainly the communication between regulatory authorities and tax authorities was very, very much lacking. You raised the bigger question as well about how tax authorities interact with each other. And one has to say, I think it is fair to say that there's been an appalling failure of communication between tax authorities about these kind of issues. The intelligence exchange between tax authorities is very poor. And I guess maybe one of the reasons for that is that there is a globally integrated network of various systems that operate in the capital markets where trading takes place. That is then, from a regulatory perspective, a broad notion of regulatory, that's sort of split down into lots of subsets, which are each regulated in isolation. Mm-hmm. So, for example, tax is regulated by country, and that's for legal reasons, obviously. If you look at the regulatory field, we might regulate by type of instrument or type of market. So there's a real distinction between the nature of the wider world in which transactions are done and the regulatory framework. And this is all contributing to part of the policy implications that I think arises from these kind of abstract trading structures.
Do you also think that the regulators were slow to pick up on what was happening? As I say, some of the numbers were eye-popping. For those of us who look at the markets every day, it seems scarcely believable that it wouldn't have raised red flags.
Well, I'd be interested in Christoph's view on this as well, because we're talking about Germany. But I would say, to be honest, I would say obviously, yes.
Christoph?
Well, for me, it's not first of all that the tax authorities cooperate, because we are talking about the tax scandal in Germany or in Denmark, and it's all about the Danish or the German tax system. German shares were sold, say, from Luxembourg to US pension funds without affecting, Germany at all, and there was only a custodian bank in Germany. So it's about a single tax authority, and let's talk first about complexity. How can we stop fraud? Not by setting a tax law, but to make the system of a refund of a tax waterproof. And we are talking about digitalization, blockchain technologies, and all that stuff. And what we still have is a single share paying a single dividend on that share X, and there is one tax on that share X, and that can be marked. A second thing, say how to detect fraudulent scheme, is more that the prosecutors may cooperate across borders. Because what we have realized, in the Danish case, in the German case, there were several US pension funds involved who were identical, who had the same trustees, so individuals, and that came up after a few years. And we have a European policy called Europol, but Europol is only allowed, to cooperate across borders in case of indirect taxes like the value-added tax, and not in the personal income tax, and that's still surprising. And for me, this is the real scandal, that we have detected the scheme, but no one really is willing, to stop that.
What could you really do to actually stop it? Let's park for one side, the idea of blockchain technology. I personally am very doubtful that it'll do half of what they say they'll do. In practical terms, what we talk about maybe improving information sharing. What kind of things are we looking at here in really practical terms that can be done to improve and prevent something like this happening again?
Again, when we talk about fraud, it's about sharing information on criminal persons.
Right.
That's important, and I guess that holds for all fraudulent scheme. And again, also you may not like a blockchain technology. It could be a different technology, but what we have to be aware about is that there are countries which are not vulnerable. So why don't we copy their system, of collecting and refunding a tax? And that could be also different from blockchain, but we have the technical know-how in the era of digitalization, and that's to prevent fraud.
Richard, what any thoughts? What would you?
Well, I agree. I mean, it follows from what I've already said that I do agree with Christoph. For me, the task here is to engage with the consequences of the systemic complexity that's created. My observation in my research on CumEx is that in most cases, we revert to an explanation of this based on what I call the bad apples view of the world. In other words, some bad apples that are causing the problems. That seemed to me the prevalent way of approaching this. But it's a fact that we have hundreds of banks involved in these transactions, thousands of individuals. And that to me raises some real questions about whether the bad apples theory of to explain this is really viable or valid. There's actually serial misconduct.
It sounds like an entire orchard.
Exactly. And so I think the real requirement is to do what we're not doing, which is to engage with that systemic complexity, try to understand what its sources are, how it can best be policed or managed, and that's the answer.
Is there something to learn from the trials themselves? What I'm getting at here is there a get-out clause that people are using that actually may, on a legal technicality, actually see them escaping punishments? And that there's some legal technicality that actually means that what people have done isn't as black and white as we've actually been painting here.
Yeah. Let's pick up the colleagues, from Berkeley, New York. I'm also teaching MBAs, masters, and we talk about corporate reputation. We talk about corporate governance, okay? And your book is titled Banking on Failure. So there is one thing, that's the corporate bodies, okay? The banks, the financial institution who should really seek for a clear governance. And we don't, cross this border. That's one side, say, from management teaching. The other side is the political dimension, right? And again, I'm in fraud. It's like money laundering. It's like, dealing drugs, that we have to close the scheme. And for Germany, I'm pretty sure that this has been going on for 2 decades and nothing happened. And we have to be aware that right now, for 2 years, there is a parliamentary investigation committee still going on in Germany, and the suspected is our acting Chancellor, Olaf Scholz.
Can I pick up and just ask a sort of follow-on question? I mean, Richard, your point about the scale of this is extraordinary because normally frauds rely on a small number of people keeping things quite tightly controlled and getting away with it. This seems like it is an enormously large number of people systematically going about defrauding the tax authorities. That seems to be a very significant problem. And is it just because it became a norm that this was okay to do, that there was some arbitrage that was acceptable? And I guess the follow-on question from you, Christoph, is these raids that have been going on, and I gather there's been 8 or 9 major raids of major global investment banks in the last month. They're taking computers and they're taking all sorts of data and documents. I'm guessing they're looking at direct email or conversational traffic, which ascertains how high up this goes. So my questions are related on scale and seniority. Richard first, and I don't know.
Well, let me pick up the first question. In the book, I look at this as being misconduct, and I'm interested in looking at a broad notion of misconduct in the banking sector. And it does seem to me that the banking sector and the financial products markets are different. One of the things I do in the book is compare things like CumEx or LIBOR or a number of other financial sector issues with, for example, Dieselgate. And the idea there is to try and bring out the differences that you see where you get structured transactions involving financial products has against a more tangible product like a car. And of course, we haven't got time today to go through all of the lessons, but just maybe I can just mention one point, and that is speed of innovation. If you're going to play around with the computer system on cars, that's going to take you a very long time to set up and execute and monetize. In financial products, the speed of innovation is automatic. Automatic's a bit strong. It's overnight. So, for example, if you get, as we saw in Germany, tax authority moves that try to head this off, counter moves can be done in a very, very rapid space of time. So there are a number of features about, I would say, about financial sector transactions that contribute to the scale. And so on. In the book, I'm half answering your question. In the book, I try and show how the banking business model leads to misconduct in relation to tax systems. It seems to me utterly inevitable.
And Christoph, what are they finding with all these emails? And
yeah, for me, it's I think much more complex to manipulate the CO2 emissions of a car compared to setting up CumEx transactions. I would say both cases are comparable. That the managers, the CEOs being responsible for that fraud, that they build up a parallel world. Okay, it is justified because no one complains, because we have governmental authorities, both in the car sector or in the financial ministries, that are not the rocket science guys, on the other side who can detect such schemes. It's similar. Say again, that parallel world, and it's interesting, I'm German, I also drive a diesel, and I have been hit personally by the diesel scandal, and I want to get my money back. But what happens with tax scandals, it's too complex for the public to understand that the damage is also for the population. We have less kindergartens, we have less places at high school, but they're to complain directly. And if there is a failure in the political system, there will no complaints at all. And finally, what has been taken up in Germany is the criminal cases by the prosecutor, not by the financial ministries. That's interesting.
Yeah.
And that shows the situation, which is a bit messy, I would say, and which undermines moral also and trust in a way in the political system.
Richard, just to pick up on Christoph's point, and we don't have very long, I appreciate here. But Christoph mentioned that, yes, this had been going on for 20 years, quite possibly in Germany. Maybe not quite as long, but certainly extensively. Does part of the issue come down to that, on the political side, on the regulatory side? Yes, it is. It's complicated. There aren't as many. And people tend to shy away from simple things. From way too simple things. Sorry.
Yeah, I think I'm sounding like a one-track record talking about complexity. I think complexity brings a considerable amount of challenges in this area. We've had an enduring complexity in this area. Actually, we've had enduring tax trading around dividends for 50 years. And in various different types and forms. So in that sense, the phenomenon of tax structured transactions around dividend dates is nothing new.
Okay, then. We've got about a minute and a half left. So I want to just one final question to Christoph then. Prediction. I mean, do you think that we will see more people put in prison from this? You mentioned the CEO who got put in prison at 77 years old. Are we still only at the start of a whole slew of criminal prosecutions?
Yeah, I'm very convinced that we will see plenty of cases in the near future. The prosecutors and all above the judges are aware that there has been, a system similar to the mafia, and that there has been silence over, say, 1 decade. And they are willing, okay, to get the money back. That's among the judges. It's not among the politicians. It's not among the populations. But I really trust the very, brave prosecutor, who is a woman indeed, and she's very brave, and the judges and the administration and the prosecutors doing a great job for our country.
Okay, I think that's just about all we have time for here. Many thanks for tuning in. I'd like to thank Christoph and Richard for a fascinating discussion. We could have gone on for far longer, but I'm afraid that's all. And thank you very much.
Thank you.